Hey everyone, welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. In the Mobile User Acquisition Show, we feature interviews with the smartest folks in mobile and growth who share invaluable, actionable, tactical insights on every aspect of mobile growth and marketing, not to mention some adjacent areas just as well. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is presented by me, Shamant Rao, CEO of the mobile growth marketing firm SearchAdsHQ, and produced by Karishma Sundaram, our superstar content marketing manager at SearchAdsHQ. Each episode includes strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile growth marketing that you can use to unlock tremendous growth for your app in a sustainable and capital efficient manner.
Our guest today is Thomas Petit. Thomas is an independent mobile growth consultant working primarily with non-gaming B2C apps. He's an external consultant for large apps. He's a collaborator assisting several agencies and an advisor for very early stage startups. He's run campaigns since the very first day of Apple Search, spending 7 figures on the platform directly, and has also run audits on many other accounts. He's certified by Apple, SearchAdsHQ, and ASOdesk, and is a regular speaker on mobile growth and Apple Search. Today, we're going to dive into everything that's changing in Apple Search with the recent Apple privacy policy changes. I think this is a very important topic because a lot of changes in Apple Search have happened mostly under the hood, somewhat subtly, and it's very, very critical to unpack and dive into a lot of these nuances, which Thomas does so clearly and so well in today's interview.
I'm very excited to welcome back Thomas Petit. Thomas, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, I'm very glad to be here. I'm a very regular listener of the show, and I have to say you push the bar very high. So I hope I can keep that up.
Your past episode was certainly one of the most popular ones we have had. And as a mutual friend of ours said, the thermometer exploded when you showed up. So certainly no pressure this time. We're going to talk about actually what could be a logical extension of the last thing we talked about, right? The last time we spoke, you talked about LAT and how that was changing things. And again, I think you spoke on another episode, you spoke about what's changing with iOS 14.5. We've had you twice. And of course, this feels like a very logical extension of those, which is what's changing with Apple Search right now, post-ATT, and in the future, right? So let's start with the high level. What's changing in terms of attribution in Apple Search?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I mean, the LAT cohort was always very peculiar with Apple Search Ads just because they deal with it completely differently to the other network. And I was happy to discuss some of the most detailed intricacy on the show, but I actually had a few other contents and explanations around what it is, how to deal with it, measurement, which to my surprise remain fairly valid for like 3 years or so, or 4 years from Apple Search Ads opening in 2016 until this year. Kind of, you can listen 2017 content around that, and it would be valid up to 3 months ago, more or less, which was surprised. If you do listen to a content I published on Apple Search Ads and LAT back then, actually it is different now, and that's why we're here today. On a high level, what happened before is Apple decided that the ads were going to be shown to people who had the IDFA 0, LAT people, limited tracking to people, but those would not be measured by the attribution framework that Apple prepared in the past. So we had part of our traffic and impact of the money we spend going into organics. And that was a big topic for a long time. Now that Apple changed the rules of the game for everybody regarding IDFA, and that we need consent to get the IDFA, the way this framework was designed was going to break. And so Apple designed a new measurement framework that is called Ad Services that was announced in January this year and eventually started to be rolled out somewhere between February and April, quite silently, actually. All MMP adjusted, and for a lot of people, it was actually almost silent, like just a little tweak. The big change here is that attribution of Apple Search Ad doesn't rely on the IDFA anymore at all, which is obviously a big change compared to what we had before, but actually in a good way, which is for the first time, we can measure the impact of people who were LAT before and who are now IDFA 0 no matter what. So that's the first positive. The second positive being Apple attribution doesn't depend on the IDFA, but it doesn't depend on your ATT status. So this is a change from before, but it's also a change compared to other channels. And I guess that means Apple Search Ads ASA needs to be handled slightly differently. In my opinion, there were other changes on the platform. There was a new format introduced with search tabs. There was like China is open for some advertisers, changing how people look at the channel. But those were all pretty marginal. And the big change is the fact that the way we measure Apple Search Ads has changed in the last 3 months. Here, for the better. For most channels, the change of ATT are kind of a bit of a nightmare, but here it's actually for the better. So yeah, good for those who work with that channel.
Right. And in the past, LAT users were not trackable just because IDFA was the main mechanism. And now, from what you're saying, everybody can be tracked deterministically, as you will.
When you say everybody can be tracked deterministically, I would say this is correct, but it needs a bit of a wording specification, which is when we say deterministically, we say user level. So we can know each user and not in aggregate, and we can follow retention metrics, LTV. We can know if that person has made an IAP purchase after 3 months, or if they renew a subscription or whatnot, because we've got user level information, and that's what deterministic means here. But I think here the confusion for some people might come from the word tracked, which in a marketer's perspective, yes, that's what we do. We track user. That means we measure that these people come from this campaign. In Apple vocabulary, we're not tracking these users. We're measuring the performance of campaign, because what Apple defines as tracking is mixing information from your company with another company. So if a campaign comes from the Facebook app or the YouTube app or another gaming app or whatever app that has some ads in it, you're tracking when you're measuring between apps. And here what's very peculiar with Apple Search Ads is you're measuring with OS app, with an operating system app. So this is not considered by Apple as tracking, because you're not crossing data with any other app. You're just crossing data with the system. So yes, for us marketers, we're tracking deterministically. For Apple, we're only measuring first-party data. That is how, and I guess here, I mean, I understand the way you said it, and I think this is the right way to say it, but it can lead to some confusion because Apple calls tracking not exactly what most marketers would call tracking. But the answer is yes, we can measure the impact of campaigns at user level data without ATT consent, which is a big difference to all other networks there.
And I think, not to get sidetracked, but the way Apple defines privacy-related terms is very strategic. They say, oh, this is basically first-party marketing. We are showing an ad on our device for installing an ad in our device. It's totally not tracking.
Too much opinion on how legit is this definition and how fair it is and what I would define as tracking, but it's clear this is how Apple defined the rules of the game, and as marketers we're playing within those rules. So at least whether we agree or not, we have to know them and we have how to deal with them. So that's where we're at.
Certainly. Can you talk about the mechanics of how user level data measurement or tracking happens without the IDFA, and the mechanics of exactly how ATT opt-in and opt-out users are treated by ASA just now?
The thing here is almost like I'm going to answer you in a trivial way, which is not either technical or exactly how it happened, but it kind of makes it easy to understand. So some users are going to see some ad impression of search ads when they search in the store, they search for fitness, they search for Tinder, they search for TikTok, whatever. They're going to see an ad and maybe they're going to install the app or not. On your side, regardless if you paid for those ad impression and regardless if this ad impression had some consequences, when a new user is going to open the app for the first time, the measurement framework basically pings an Apple server and say, oh, I've got this new user. Does he come from one of my ASA campaign or not? So sometimes the payload will come back empty, like, nope, didn't come from any of your campaign. Sometimes the payload will come with a lot of details about, oh yeah, it was that campaign and blah, blah, and blah, blah. And this payload is actually pretty granular in the sense that you can get keyword level data, also the creative performance. And from that moment, I mean, you can assign like, okay, so that user just opened the app, come from that campaign. And then you can technically, and you can legally follow whatever he does after, because this is first party. So his retention metrics, do they buy stuff? You don't have limitation about 24 hours or anything like that. So basically it's a ping at the first open and you get the payload. Is this from search ad, which campaign, which ad group, which keyword, blah, blah, blah. Technically, there is a small difference if a user has opted in ATT and you have this opt-in early enough, which is another tricky bit, but which is Apple gives you the exact timestamp for the click only for the opted in cohort. Here, I believe for 99% people, this has zero implication whatsoever. Like, okay, this guy comes from that campaign. Maybe the click was 5 minutes ago. Maybe the click was yesterday. It's actually very, very minor. So there is what they call the advanced payload, which is when there is opt-in, and the basic paywall, which is when there is no opt-in. But the information that comes from the basic paywall and what you can do with it in terms of TV and cohort analysis is actually more than enough than you need for most of the application. Some people will maybe use the timestamp information for some media mix model and things like that. I personally think if you're at that level, maybe you should be a guest of the mobile user acquisition show.
Yeah, so right, so definitely I think the mechanics make sense, right? So in some ways, if the Apple server pings you and says, yes, this is your user, you tie it to your internal ID rather than the IDFA.
Exactly. I mean, at the moment you receive this information, like, okay, oh, that user who just comes from campaign X and keyword Y and blah, blah, you have internally, I mean, tools do that automatically without you doing it, but maybe you have your own system and database and analytics. You basically assign an internal user ID, something that only you can use. I mean, if you share this with another app or with any vendor, it's pretty much useless because it's just yours. The same way analytics tools work. When Amplitude or Mixpanel see a new user, they assign you an internal user ID that is only for you. And this is exactly how it works here for Apple Search Ads. This user is, oh, I recognize this user and I can follow whatever they do after. And that's why we say it's user level and not aggregated or cohorted. You know exactly who is this user, so you can follow after whatever they do inside your app. It's not like you can track them on the internet and know that they've buy some shoes on that e-commerce, but at least for you, you know, if they reopen the app, if they opt in the push notification, if they purchase, if they retain, if they invite friends, blah, blah, blah.
Right. And even for an MMP, they would get some sort of user ID, which we don't always see. If you're using a MMP interface, you don't always see this one, but if you have a PI system, you would probably have an ID for that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, MMP would do the exact same as analytics tools does. They assign some kind of user ID internally to that user, and then you can use that, which actually brings an interesting detail about this new framework, the ad services, which is in the past, you could implement the old framework by yourself or through an MMP. A lot of apps have an MMP for other reasons, another channel. So it was just simpler to go through the MMP. Yeah. In this new era with ad services, the same thing remains true. You can rely on your MMP to do this work. And if you have an MMP, I mean, why not? You know, it's there, just use it. Let them do the job you're paying them for. And that works just great. I mean, I didn't have any problem with any of the major MMP regarding ad services. You can, and I would say this is mostly either for people who are too small or early to have an MMP for other reasons, but maybe they're starting with Apple Search Ads, you can implement this framework on your own without an MMP. Some people might want to implement it by themselves because they love to use internal tool, and maybe for the long term, you don't rely on anyone if you want to switch MMP or whatever. But there's no, I wouldn't say there's no big benefit or big drawbacks of doing it yourself. And for what I've seen, most people just do the plug and play integration through the MMPs. Just does make a lot of sense, and there's nothing better in doing it yourself in that particular case, I believe.
Yeah. And in the past, we factored in LAT, and we had an entire episode that you spoke about that, right? And exactly how you factor in LAT in your campaign strategy. Now, post-ATT, what changes?
Before this user who couldn't be measured, obviously a lot of people assign a different value to it, either because they're extrapolating and the uncertainty is higher, but also because a lot of advertisers thought, oh, if this is not going to be measured, I'm not going to target them at all, and I'm just going to go for LAT off only, which has pushed the price of the LAT off inventory up. And as a reaction, many advertisers have their campaign structured on, oh, if those are LAT off user, I'm probably going to bid slightly differently because I get different information, but also because the inventory price is different. So I need to adjust to that. Now, this factor seems to disappear because we can measure user whether they're LAT or not. Actually, there's no more LAT, so it became a little bit irrelevant. But at the same time, because a lot of people haven't changed the way the campaign run, because this is fairly new, and because you still have tricky bits of targeting between knowing if a user is a new user or the returning user, most people will have kept their old campaign structure. And this is actually what I do and what I recommend for many cases, maybe not all cases, but in most cases, I don't think it had a huge implication. So it's kind of curious in a way that something that has established itself a little bit as standard because there was this LAT thingy actually remains fairly valid in a post-LAT era. Inventory price difference is still a little bit there. And I mean, if your company already structured that way, you can restructure, but it's not gonna be a game changer for sure. So a lot of people just kept the way they were doing before. And this is what I'm doing personally.
Yeah, can you refresh people's memories, or if people are not familiar with it, can you tell folks about what the campaign structure that you had recommended in the past was? And does anything need to change? And why was it structured in that way? And what changes, if at all? Yeah.
So I guess there are three levels to the structure. The first level is at campaign level, due to how you can put the settings in your campaign. And this is pretty much the same before and after. And what I've recommended, what Apple is recommended, and what most agencies out there or even internal teams are recommended is actually pretty much the same. Usually split campaigns by, is it brand terms or not? Is it competitors? Is it generic, or is it discovery? So you more or less have kind of 4 campaign type. I know people who merge discovery with generic. It's kind of not critical, but I guess putting brand aside is very critical. So basically you have 4 types of campaign because the performance is slightly different strategically and so on. And then some people decide to bundle some countries to have less structure burden. Some people decide to have one of each of these 4 for each country, which are around 60 countries. So that would be a maximum of 240 campaign. And I guess that would be the most developed structure. And this is pretty much the same as it was before. And it's pretty standard. More or less everybody does. The only choice is, are you going to bundle more countries or not, depending on how you organize internally. When you move down to the ad group level, here, I think there's one thing that can be done in very different ways. Some people like to group keywords by their meaning. Some people like to group keywords by their LTV. Some people like to group keywords by, am I actually spending or not? So maybe a high spending keyword would have its own ad group on its own. And then you've got an ad group with long tail of keywords because you bundle them all. I've talked to a bunch of people working with one and the other method, and I've seen various again on that. I don't believe there's one that's better than the other for performance. So it's mostly to how you like to get organized yourself and how the person managing the channel is comfortable with for measurement. But there are various ways to do that. And also on that level, I think nothing's changed. It's just the same as before. But then the last part is something that I believe is changing a little bit for some, which is I've often recommended So once you decide, maybe you work on LTV tiers. So you've got high LTV keyword and medium LTV keyword and low LTV keyword, maybe, and this is your 3 ad groups. What I would have recommended is to have then each of these 3 ad group move into 3, well, each, let's say, I call them concept. Each keyword block would be moved into 3 ad groups that have the same keyword in within, but different targeting based on, is this user a new user LAT off, returning user LAT off, or anyone? You don't really get a clean split, because as soon as you don't put any kind of age or gender criteria, usually we use 18 plus to split LAT off and not, because Apple doesn't want to share the age of users who were LAT on. So basically we end up with 3 groups, and the open group, the one with 0 targeting, does overlap with the other 2, which could get sometimes messy. And in a way, I would understand if some people say, oh, I don't need to go through all of that anymore. I can just bundle them all because there's no measuring issue anymore with this LAT. And that would make sense. And that would simplify a little bit the structure. Personally, I like to keep this separation, this split between these 3 groups, because I've seen the conversion and ARPU or retention performance of new users and returning user being entirely different. Also, a lot of companies would have budget that is exclusively for acquisition, and some returning users not exactly remarketing, but let's say they often tag it this way because it's simpler in concept. And me, I like to separate it because I often see different performance, so I don't like to bundle it too much. But we have to admit that this separation is not entirely clean, because Apple made the distinction in you can't have clean ad group. The open ad group will overlap with the other 2 all the time. If you're a small advertiser, if you don't want to go into this kind of detail, it's totally fine to have them all together. Personally, I don't know, I like to have my things splitted, and also it helps when you've got budget changes, like I'm just going to keep the returning user or just the new users. And actually, I know I make long answers, but that's something that we saw in the new format, the search tab format that Apple released about 2-3 months ago. For pretty much everybody I talked, the performance of these new campaigns were really dreadful. And I've seen a lot of people pull back and just stop them entirely because they didn't make sense. But I've seen a few advertisers that told me like, oh yeah, it looks dreadful. But actually on some segment of returning user, it's either very important for us strategically, or it actually brings decent metric. And that shows to what extent returning user can really vary from new users. Sure. And if you would never have split it between new and returning in this way, you would never have seen that maybe in search tab that works. And I think this kind of logic can apply outside of search tab for other campaigns. And for me, that's the benefit of splitting them out, having a little bit better of a view on each, even though you know it's not 100%, because the open group is always going to mess a little bit with your data.
Right, and definitely considering how different the new and returning users will be, it certainly makes sense to separate that out.
Yeah.
Can you help us understand why have the open group at all? Because you have new, you have returning. Some would say that covers your entire universe of users.
Yes, on paper. And here it's kind of a little bit like before there was LAT. So if you only get the new and the returning one, basically you were living off maybe around 40% of the inventory. Depends the country and the vertical. Sometimes it's 20, sometimes it's 50, but basically a third of the inventory you wouldn't capture if you only had new and returning. So that's why before we used to have the open group. There's no more LAT, but Apple still makes a difference of some user. So that's the case for people who are under 18. Apple say, we don't want to share if it's the new returning user. Actually, we don't want to even know ourselves, which I discovered on a tricky bit that is actually not true. Apple needs to know if they're new returning because they report it elsewhere. So it's kind of weird but anyway, so that's the kind for underage users. There are some kind of blocked user because of education device or some bizarre criteria that they add. But there is also this new option, which Apple called Apple Ads personalization, that a small portion of user would go and deactivate, which only applies to Apple Ads. But in this case, Apple doesn't want to share at all if those users are new or returning. And so if you only target new and returning, you need 18 plus, you're going to leave on the table all these users. Ads personalization, underage, and the bizarre other edge case education device.
Yeah. So in other words, ads personalization is the new LAT.
In a way, yes. Technically,
way.
they defined it differently, but for the matter of targeting on search ads, this is pretty much the equivalent, yes.
Yeah. For the purpose of campaign construction and strategy, it sounds like that is the case.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And it also sounds like the ads personalization people, there aren't a lot, but it is still non-zero.
Here, that's a very tricky question, because the assumption is that only a tiny minority of users are actually going to go in this setting that is quite buried down in settings on iPhones. And I would believe if it was clean and only people who decide to opt out, it would be a tiny percentage. But the tricky bit is, one, nobody knows about this percentage. There was never any communication about it, and you can't actually follow it precisely. Because the same way before we had the information LAT, not LAT in the Apple interface, you don't get this information about ads personalization. So we don't really know the percentage. The other one is on paper, it said that users that were on LAT before, when they upgraded to iOS 14.5, they got moved automatically to ads personalization off. But I have no way to prove that this was true in 100% of the case or not.
Sure.
Which, if entirely true, and we know by edge cases that there were bizarre stuff happening there. People who were LAT off and suddenly had this option on by default. Some people had the option grayed out. That it's not exactly the same, but from far away, we might be able to assume that this percentage could be close to the old LAT one, basically because Apple ported the settings out from the other one. So only 3 months after, so there's not so many new devices. I guess over time, and when Apple is going to release new iPhones, this percentage might go down a little bit, because on a new device, you're not going to be asked for LAT or not. So it's possible. The LAT percentage was always going up. And I have it's a bit of a guess here, really, but I have the opinion that the ads personalization percentage might actually go down a little bit as people get new devices.
Right.
But let's see how it's going to happen. And we can't follow it very closely. So I couldn't even tell you if it's 2%, 40%. I have a rough idea that from far away, let's say it's close to the LAT percentage we had before. But
and from what you're saying, having new returning open lets you cover all your bases. So that's the safest way to approach it.
Safest, I don't know. It's more like if you're trying to max out your spend on search ads because you want to scale it, or if for some strategic reason you want to have very high share of voice, you want to defend your brand, for example, limiting to new and returning could actually lower down your potential reach. But for some people who are extremely focused on performance only, don't have this strategic perspective, or maybe if the performance is actually really bad, you might want to only target a percentage of people just because this is the only way you get performance. So that depends on the case. Actually, I've seen both cases of people who really want to go for everyone, and people who are like, oh no, the performance is bad there, let's go only for new users. In some other case, only for returning users. There's kind of all. I can't tell you straight up which is going to be the case, because I've seen that different apps have different behavior on that.
Just to switch gears a bit, going forward, I'd love to hear your perspective of what's happening going forward, especially since iOS 15 is announced. In terms of being able to do testing with ASA in the future, there are a lot of changes coming. Can you speak to what's changing?
Yeah, that's actually very exciting. And a bit of a hot topic this summer when you don't talk about IDFA and SKAdNetwork. A lot of people, especially in the ASO world, are talking about these new tools that are coming. And I've been working with the App Store maybe for 8 years or something, and we've been waiting for an A/B test tool forever, and it's coming soon. So everybody's super excited. Here, I guess a lot of people that were sometimes using Creative Set for ASO A/B testing purpose are going to switch to this new tool. Creative Set were never great for this. There was a lot of bias introduced and a lot of factors you didn't control and limitations. So actually, this is great news. It doesn't impact ASA directly, but it kind of Creative Set will be less used for this because there will be a proper tool. But there is another feature that Apple has promised us that is super exciting, which is I forgot the name, the custom listing. No, how do you call it?
Custom product pages. I think.
Custom product pages, which basically you can show a different ASO listing, a different appearance campaign by campaign. And here there is really a potential of improving ASA performance by showing something more specific. If you know a returning user, if it's a newer returning user, you might show them different stuff, like more advanced feature to returning user, for example. Or a lot of apps have USP that captures different, let's say, intent. I work in the mental health space with apps that target meditation and yoga and stress and anxiety and self-improvement. And they will be able, by which keyword people are typing, to actually provide an experience that is custom to that. So that's actually super exciting. It's not live yet. First, because Apple will only give us this with iOS 15 in fall this year, but also because we're waiting at this point. So this feature works on a custom URL. You need to say, oh, if the user types this URL, then showing that version. And at the moment, we can't really input any URL in Apple Search Ads. So we're waiting not only for iOS 15, but also for an update from Apple in their own ads interface to open up this possibility. What I'm hearing, which is just a rumor, is that this is not going to be ready for iOS 15 launch. So I obviously don't have dates, and Apple typically doesn't communicate on future release, but maybe we'll have to wait for 3-6 months for this, but it's coming. Yeah. The same thing applies to Google and Facebook. And I think this is going to be a very powerful feature. We've been waiting for it for years, and it really gets in the benefit of both user and the developer. The user is going to see something more relevant, and the developer will be able to cater his marketing message and his USP to what's most relevant to the user. So I really think this feature is a win-win situation here.
Yeah, definitely. It's certainly something we're excited about, but also curious about, because it's not very clear as to the mechanics of how this will work in the interface.
Very excited, but we already know there will be limitations here and there, and there's a maximum number of it, and we don't know when, and but it's still exciting.
There's going to be the whole privacy threshold that they're going to throw at us. But,
I hadn't thought about that, but I'm not sure it's going to apply on Apple Search Ads though, but let's see.
Well, if you have a custom product page, it's my understanding that you can take any URL and send traffic to it.
Yes.
And if they let you take any URL, presumably you can use it for Google and Facebook. And if you do that, they will throw the privacy threshold at us. That's one of the things I worry about.
Yeah, but I guess this information you're going to see on this custom page, you're only going to have it in App Store Analytics. So it doesn't really enable you to follow the cohort and so on. So it's kind of a bit of a loosey thing. But yeah, like you said, there's still a bit of uncertainty because nobody has seen it. We've seen screenshots and descriptions, but it's not the same as having all the option. It's just, I think it's a big leap forward. So even though it has limitation in privacy, in privacy threshold and other limitation, I heard it's like 35 pages maximum or something like this.
30.
So there is a maximum, but it's still very exciting. I'm really looking forward to this moment. There's also something new that is very relevant. It's not like a side feature on the side, like, I don't know, recommendations or stuff like that. It's a real new feature.
Just to also switch gears to another topic that is very top of mind for a lot of marketers, right? It's that since SKAdNetwork has broken a lot of tracking in a lot of conventional channels, a lot of folks have been like, oh, budgets are going to shift to ASA. A lot of folks have speculated that, look, Apple did this so they could capture budgets, they could grow the services category. And I think you probably mentioned that too. All of this said, what have you seen happen in terms of, have you seen the budget shift to ASA? Do you think that's likely? Has that happened already?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I've read a few, usually mainstream media comments on this before SKAdNetwork released of, oh yeah, people are going to switch more of the budget to Apple ads, and they're going to eat the Google and Facebook ad budget, and they're going to take it to Apple, and Apple is doing this to gain market share. I guess the logic behind it is valid, but if you look at the nature of Apple's ads as a channel, this was never going to be able to happen. And it's true that on one side, a lot of people get relatively good performance from search ads, and now after high uncertainty, or in most cases, horrible result from SKAdNetwork campaign. So it would make sense to think like, oh yeah, let's shift budget there. The thing is that in practice, this is very rarely possible. A lot of people were already maxing out what they can get on search ads. And it's a search inventory. It's not like a feed where you can put the ads to anyone. If somebody is not looking for something relevant for you, even if you manage to show your ads to them, it's not going to produce much of an impact. And so I never thought it was really possible to shift your Google and Facebook budget onto Apple. And what I've seen over the last 2 months or 3 months since SKAdNetwork is ramping up is that actually the inventory price, they haven't changed much. And I think this is the signal that this shift of budget didn't really happen. There was clearly a shift of budget towards Android, and more people are, this summer at least. Let's see on the long term, and I'm not sure on the long term this is going to hold, but at least for this quarter, the inventory pressure on Android is really high. I've read a couple of reports. Android is about 30% more expensive, the ad inventory since SKAdNetwork release. I don't think this is true at all for Apple ads. I would say actually things have been pretty flat. And I put that on the fact that a search channel, you can't just push a button and get more of it. So unless your account was not really optimized for a big number of keywords or all the countries or targeting limitation like this, only new and returning, and you can expand a little bit, but it's not like from a day to another, you can move from 10K to 100K of spend. Just never going to happen on a search channel. It's just the nature of it.
Yeah, right. And, even if you compare it to Google search on the web, it's very different. People who want to scale Google search, they go to display and YouTube.
I mean, as long as Apple doesn't add inventory that is not search, of course, there will be this limitation. But I would say even on when you look at Google search on the web, there's a lot more long tail keywords. And we're not talking about the same kind of volume either. I know there's 500 million visits in the App Store every week or something like this, but not everybody goes to the search. And when people go to the search part, it's very short tail actually in the App Store. When you look at search on google.com or google. Whatever, the search are a lot more long tail and there's a lot more of it. So actually, I would even say it's easier to scale up your spend on Google search alone. And then you've got display and YouTube and whatnot. Where on Apple search ads, like you don't have this extra inventory, but even on the search itself, you're already more limited by the nature of the inventory and the fact that it's just this pool of people looking for. I mean, the search behavior is really different in an app store than it is on a browser, and that limits a lot. I mean, often you can scale a Google search budget a little bit if you work deep enough on long tail and all kind of extensions and stuff. You can always scale it a little bit. On search ads, most people I consult on search ads, they're not telling me I've got terrible performance. They tell me how can I get more of it? And
exactly.
In some cases, I'm just like, you're at 95% of what you can reach. We can optimize marginally, but there's no way we're going to 2x the channel.
Yeah. It's definitely not the easiest channel to scale because there is a ceiling to it, right? And that's not going to change unless Apple introduces a non-search placement anytime soon. And like you said, the search tab was not very successful. We'll see how that shakes out. Thomas, this has been incredibly comprehensive as always, so no surprises there, right? This is perhaps a good place for us to start to wrap up. Thank you again for being a guest on this Mobile User Acquisition show. But before we let you carry on, could you tell folks how they can find out more about you and everything you do?
Yeah, sure. I'm pretty visible publicly, but easy to find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and I'm always happy to exchange on a few Slack groups, open Slacks where I'm participating. Some of them being the ISO Slack or Mobile Dev Memo or Mobile App Privacy. There's a few of them. I'm there. If you want to directly contact me, Twitter is fine, LinkedIn is fine. You can find my email online as well, and this would be the best place to find me.
Wonderful. We will link to all of that. And should we mention your email newsletter as well?
I do have a newsletter. I didn't mention it because I haven't sent any episode this summer because I was taking a bit of time off, and I was also looking at how the dust was gonna settle a bit on SKAdNetwork. But it's coming back this fall. And so, yeah,
wonderful.
thanks.
So we will send people there too. Wonderful,
Great.
wonderful, Thomas.
Great.
Great.
madv.io.
We will link to that. We will, yeah, madv.io. We will link to that and everywhere else you are in the show
It
notes.
will be back. It will be back. I was waiting for sponsors, but they're not there.
Oh, wow.
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
All right. Okay, cool. All right, Thomas, we will let you carry on. Thank you so much for being on the Mobile User Acquisition Show.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and looking forward for the next show as well. So yeah, congrats for keeping the quality up.
For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here, or check out our blog, rocketship.hq.com/blog.